Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jen, your co-host for today, and I'm here with the author of a book that has just absolutely floored me. I loved it, and I can't wait for everybody to read it. So let's get into this. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. My name is Tammy Greenwood, and I write under T. Greenwood. And my book is Such a Pretty Girl. This is my most recent book. It comes out on October 25th. And it is a story about a young actress and her very ambitious stage mother, set primarily in 1970s New York City. But it also takes place in the current time with Ryan, who's the main character, the actress, former actress in the main timeline, raising her daughter in Vermont and having to revisit her past because of some things that come to light.
Yeah, this book was so fascinating. There's so much I want to ask, but before we get into the book itself, I was wondering if we could start by you talking a little bit about your writing career and some of the, the things that have interested you over time and what you write about and how it led you to this book.
Sure. So I'm a veteran. I've been doing this a long time now. My first book came out in 1999. So almost 25 years, coming up on 25 years. And this is my 14th novel. And it's different than all the others, and it's got some similarities. I think there are themes that I come back to again and again, from book to book. One of them being mother and daughter relationships. That really fascinates me. I'm a daughter and I have daughters. This book, I just really wanted to explore a lost time and a lost place. So New York City in the 1970s is just such an intriguing period of time, especially because it's when I grew up. I was a child. I didn't grow up in New York, but I was a little girl in the 70s. And this book is very much about the commodification of young women in Hollywood, in the modeling industry, the exploitation of these young girls. And I grew up with, Brooke Shields and Jodie Foster and, all of these young actresses who were doing some really edgy, controversial films. And the media that I was immersed in as a child is shocking now. I can imagine my own kids being exposed to the messages that were being sent to young girls. In the book there's she models for, it's called Baby Love in the book, but it's very clearly modeled after Love's Baby Soft. And Love's Baby Soft's ad campaign in the 1970s was innocence. It's sexier than you think, and which is horrible. And the models often looked either like young girls made up to look older, or women made up to look like girls. And really, I always write, I never write with an agenda, but there are certain things that are important to me that find their way in. And I think, that sort of idea of how exploitative, media was and continues to be with young girls is something that really fascinates me. So yeah, there are a lot of themes that, I've explored in other books. But this is the first book, that I've written about show business, and so that was really fun. It was really sort of something I always try to challenge myself and go someplace I haven't been before, and this is a place I hadn't been before.
That's very cool. It's I was very interested to learn just now about some of the actual young actresses who may have you may have been thinking about when writing Ryan. And there was it was a very strange era for filmmaking in some ways, because it was only, I guess a decade after the code was lifted. So there was just more mature content in movies in general.
Right.
And there was no, I guess, safety measures in place for children or for young people who were on these sets making these extremely mature films.
Exactly. There's a great podcast called You Must Remember This. And I listened over the summer. I did a lot of driving this summer. And there's a whole series done called the erotic 80s or something. And it was about that. It was about sort of what happened, when the code was lifted. And then there was, all these movies in the 70s that were really pushing boundaries, and Taxi Driver and Pretty Baby, and like a lot of very controversial films. And there weren't the rules and protective measures in place. There just wasn't the stuff that's in place now. I have a really dear friend whose daughter is an actress, and it's like your parent is on set with you all the time. There's a teacher there ensuring that your education is not interrupted. There's so many things. There's your money is protected. There's all these things that just were not the case when my character was a child actress.
Yeah, and it seemed doubly dangerous for her because, and this is probably very common with child stars, I imagine, but that she couldn't always necessarily depend on her mother to step in and provide that protection. So let's talk a little bit about like the central mother-daughter relationship, because it's really complicated and it's really fascinating, and it's hard to characterize as either all bad or all good. Like the truth is always a little bit more complex than trying to characterize things as one or the other. So could you talk a little bit about where this relationship came from and how you built it?
Well, I have to preface this by saying that this is not my mother. And my relationship with my mom. And I've actually had readers, I always write these complicated moms, and my mom is like so incredibly wonderful and sweet and kind, and none of these things. So she was at a reading with me once, and the book actually was about had a mom who had Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and somebody stood up and they were like, well, where's your mother now? And I said, she's right there. That's not my mom. This is fiction. But anyway, so Fiona is she's a piece of work. She's she's a single mother, and an aspiring actress herself. Just meet her, and she and Ryan are living at like an artist community. It's a summer stock theater, but they live there year round. And the dad is not in the picture. Nobody knows anything about the dad. And so she's raising this child, but she's really very childlike herself and very ambitious. And she wants to be an actress, and she's, diligent with her studying her lines and, being at the ready. And she's obsessed with discovery stories, how certain actresses were discovered. And so when the opportunity arises for her to go to New York City and try to make a career, she leaps on it and brings this little girl, her daughter, with her. And there's a very fuzzy line between Fiona and Ryan, partly because of age and partly because what is her dream ends up manifesting in her daughter when Ryan is discovered by a modeling agent on the street. And she quickly pivots from, all of that like ambition and drive and passion. She channels it into Ryan and her. But she's also, an alcoholic, and she's negligent. She's a free spirit, but she's kind of counts on the tribe to raise the child rather than to, sort of taking charge. And that was another thing that I really wanted to do with this book, was to explore the communities, these sort of makeshift families. They have one in Vermont at this, this summer stock theater. And then in New York, they moved to a community which actually exists in real life called West Beth, which is an artist residence in the West Village. And it was founded in the late 60s, early 70s to be a community. It's a federally funded community for artists. And that's where they wind up. And there are a lot of people who will take care of Ryan. So Fiona doesn't always have to, they live with their friends. It's a building filled with people. The doors are always open. The children are kind of feral. There's a community to take care of her. I'm not sure how she would behave as a mother if she didn't have that, but I think she also seeks it out. Think she, maybe is aware of her own failings. I like to think she's maybe aware of her own failings and knows that Ryan will be cared for if she disappears for a day or two or three, which she does. But yeah, she's a complicated character, but I also am writing her through a child's eyes, and children love their parents.
Yes.
Good parents and bad parents, they love their parents, and Ryan loves her mom. And it's only over time that she really starts to see her mom, as being a very flawed person. And that's what this book really is about, is that moment in time when she goes from sort of being innocent and just full of desire for her mother's love to being able to see those cracks and flaws. So that's what the book is really about, is that moment when daughter becomes aware of mother's failings.
Yeah, it was really moving to me and very striking. It occurred to me while reading that like everyone kind of like gets to know their parents twice, like you get to know them through a child's eyes, and then you kind of get to know them as an adult, where you maybe have like a more multifaceted view of them. And a lot of like the dynamics between Ryan and Fiona seemed like very like codependent almost, I want to say. Like Fiona made Ryan like responsible for her emotions in a
Right.
lot of real ways, and like it I think I maybe identified with the way that Ryan like really does a lot of the parenting for Fiona, like they're really raising each other in some
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. And I think, they are very, there's a line even in the book where, it's like, the mother is like, claiming to be her protector, but she knows that she protects her, and she spends the bulk of her life protecting her. And as an adult, when the story opens, is she has to make a decision if she's going to continue doing that or not. And I think, that's a very difficult thing to do when when your entire relationship is that sort of codependent, keeping each other's secrets, and a lot of things. It takes a certain strength and courage, I think, to break out of that, for Ryan anyway.
Absolutely. And there's another mother-daughter dynamic at work too, which is Ryan and her daughter, which is like a very different relationship. And it's like it's an interesting to see Ryan as a child, and then see Ryan as a mother herself, like trying to maybe forge a different path than her own mother did.
Right, exactly. And the interesting thing is that she returns to the place where she grew up. It's almost like a second chance. She goes back, and she goes back to this artist community in Vermont, and creates her bubble. She creates this beautiful bubble around her daughter. And that's being threatened now too, because her daughter's 18, and all of a sudden she has to let her break out of this bubble. And Ryan also has crippling anxiety, which she has had since she was a little girl. And whether or not she's going to allow that to, to sort of rule the way she treats her daughter, and her daughter's very natural, desire to grow up, and I think for me, it was really important to have those dual timelines. Not everybody loves the dual timeline, but I'm fascinated by that, because I feel like, these big things happen in the past, and then I want to know, like, how does this affect things in the future? And so that was really interesting to me, what kind of mom Ryan became. And I think she's a really good mom, but she's a very scared mom. She's very scared, and I can sympathize with that. I think, parents, especially contemporary parents of, teenagers, it's a hard time to be raising kids. And this book is set in 2019, not in, with all the things that happened, after that we all, but yeah.
Yeah, I really I really enjoyed the two different timelines myself, because I think that so much of like what obviously Ryan goes through a lot of like things in the world that are like external things happening to her, but a lot of the book is also about her, like her inner life, and her emotional journey, and how she has come to view things that happened to her in a totally different light, just with the passage of time and with, growing up and becoming more mature. And so I think that like dual timelines let you like illustrate that internal process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think, it'd be a very different book if the entire book were about her history, and just the time in the past. It alternates chapters, and we get to see that sort of childlike perspective in the childhood chapters. But in the adult chapters, there's this opportunity it's like a new lens. It's like peering at all those things that happened within a sort of enlightened filter. There's a new way of looking at things, and I think she really hadn't done that. She's really forced to do that by the events that transpire, are the things that force her out of her sort of, she's sort of escaped a little bit and is, reclusive and, just avoiding. and this is, this story is about making her confront things, including her mom, but also the truth of, how she was exploited and taken advantage of and treated inappropriately by the adults in her life.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's, something very interesting about both settings, like both the Vermont summer stock theater where they live year round, and then the West Beth in the city. They're both these kind of, very, like, I want to say like hippy dippy, like communal places where they do live this sort of like communal life together. And as you said, they are like, raising this child together. But the book also does a really good job of showing like some of the, the dark undercurrents also. And I think a lot of that has to do with the 70s too, because like and the year it is in particular, like I'd love to talk about that. Like a lot of this is happening in the Blackout Summer of 1977. And so there's a lot of like childhood excitement and a lot of like rosy, I guess like rose colored glasses
Right.
view of like what's happening, but then a lot of also kind of darker, scarier stuff.
Right. Well, I had this book when I was a little kid, and it was such an interesting book. It was the Country Mouse, City Mouse book. And it had really like interesting not even illustrations. They were almost like 3D kind of photographs or something. But that book like had a huge impact on me as a kid, because I grew up in Vermont in a really rural area. But I would go to New York City in the summers with summers and winters with my dance teacher, who would take a couple of us down to take master classes. And so I was there like in New York City as a child. And so I have very different memories, like, I mean, I like than my experience in New York now, and so I wanted to go to that place. Like it was magical to me. And I know it was probably freaking terrifying. Like it was like, it was a sketchy place. Like we did not go to Times Square. There were places that we just did not go. And the things that we saw on the street, that I, as a child, had no perspective, no idea what was going on around me. And I really wanted to replicate that sense of wonder. And this is a time when the Twin Towers had just been built, and I wanted a place where she felt safe in the city, which is this community, this West Beth community. But there's always dangers lurking everywhere, and for me, Henri, the photographer character in the story, who's a really important character, he is capturing that juxtaposition of her innocence and then the grit. And there are a series of chapters in the book that are the actual photographs that he takes. They're descriptions of the photographs that he takes, and they're very I mean, I don't think Ryan sees this, but there's always something happening. There's a one taken of her at the piers off of Christopher Street area, which was where the gay men usually would go and be together. And so there's, a scene where he takes her there, and she can hear, she knows there's something happening behind her, but, she's in the moment, it's raining, and, there's this innocence about her, but he's capturing the background as well, and so each of those, I don't know if anybody me will get that, but that's what I was trying to do with those chapters, was to really show what his artistic sensibility was and what he was doing with his art, and using her as this sort of, just beautiful, innocent child, and then this really dirty, dark cityscape around her.
Mm. Yeah, I loved that character. I thought Henri was so interesting, and his relationship with Ryan was very sweet and very tender. And I think that he did a lot of this sort of emotional work of parenting that like maybe Fiona didn't. And oh, that reminds me too of the quote that opens your book that talks about photographs. A photograph is a secret about a secret, which I think was it Diane Arbus who said that? Yeah.
Yeah, and
And
she actually lived in Westbeth.
really?
That's where she died. Yeah, that's where she
Wow.
took her life. Yeah, was in Westbeth. I learned so many fascinating things about that place. I mean, it was just, incredible, the different people who lived there. But yeah, she was one of the photographers who lived there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I definitely want to know more about this place because I've been to the West Beth Theater, but I didn't know that there was this community attached to
Oh, cool.
it.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm. Um, but yeah, that quote is so relevant, because I think especially to Henri's photos, the way that you describe them, like every photo that depicts something is also like choosing not to depict something else, and so
Mhm.
like I don't know, it's an interesting way to use like the medium of photography to also play into like the themes that you're working with in this book. Mhm.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm a photographer as well. And so I often squeak a photographer into my novels. I mean, it just really interests me. The art form really interests me because it's storytelling, right? It's
Mm,
visual storytelling. But there's also this sort of there's always this ethical question, when you're taking photos. And I think, Henri has a really interesting moral compass. And when they're going through his photographs and, ones that he kept in a drawer called tristesse, which is sadness, where
mm,
he, would capture things that he didn't feel were really for view, that they belonged to the people he took the photos of. And he would often return his photographs to the subjects, which I think is sort of interesting. And that
mm.
becomes important near the end of the book. But yeah.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about, the thing that happens because we've been talking around it, and I think it's a good idea because a lot of it is just so explosive and interesting, and it speaks to things that have happened in the last few years in the world.
Right. Right.
Mm. Um, when you were writing New York in the 70s, and Westbeth, was there any research that you did to sort of help you shape your depiction? Because it's very evocative and it's very specific in some of its details. And I was wondering what your work was like to kind of recreate this past New York.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to have spoken to two people who one is a former model who grew up there as a child and around that time, a little bit later, I think, and the other woman still lives there and she's an artist, and they were both incredibly helpful. They just, told me the little details, like the fact that the ceilings are like waves, and just like the types of people that live there, the games that children played there, like to be there. And just like little things, like there are these incredible, I don't know if you've been in the courtyard, but there are these incredible balconies, and it looks like an Escher drawing. When you look up, there's just these like interesting balconies, and there are duplexes, and the balconies are often the only way to get out, like if there were a fire or something. And so I had to I had to learn about that, like where would the balcony be, how would how where would you go, and only somebody who had like lived there would be able to give those details and that information. But I learned so many cool things, like Robert De Niro's dad did live there for
Oh,
a period.
wow.
He's an artist. Vin Diesel grew up there. He had artist family, both very bohemian childhood. And there's a little Easter egg in the book, and that's when Ryan talks about having gone to see a play in the Jane Hotel. and this little boy who's in the play. That little boy is actually Vin Diesel. He was in a play. He was in a play about the Natural History Museum, I guess, that was performed at the Jane Hotel, which was right across from Westbeth, like right up the street. And so just some really cool things. And the puppeteer, they're at the Westbeth. The West Village Halloween parade actually did start. Its genesis was at Westbeth, and there's a puppeteer who lives there. I think he still lives there, who started it, and and now it's grown into this enormous thing. But there's a scene, as in the book, where there's the Halloween parade, and it was very early in its life back then. So that was really fun, and just so many, I love setting books in eras that are sort of lost, and getting all those really important details in. And I actually, she and Henri take a walk down to the piers to take that photograph that I mentioned, and they crossed by a couple of gay bars, and I actually found those bars by watching a Village People video from the 70s that showed like the awnings and the names of the bars. And I was like, oh my God, this is like perfect. This is exactly the street they would have been walking down. And, just you get really creative. The internet is like the best thing in the world for a writer who wants to, because when I started writing, and that's how long I've been writing, like I didn't have that. Like there was, I couldn't just like Google Earth something and look and be like, oh, this is the way it looks now, or, find those wonderful historical resources that we have. And I sound like a get off my lawn, but it's true. Like it's magical. It's totally magical.
It is. I mean, like there's so much stuff that you would have had to like go to a library or some archive.
Totally.
And now you can Google it in 2 seconds, which is like
exactly
super, super useful, I think, for that kind of like set dressing and,
Totally.
And I think that it is so apt that you are like recreating this lost world with 1970s New York, because like the scenes in the present really illustrate that, because like, she's constantly marveling just at like how much has changed in the city since the last time she was there, and how it's like, the areas where like it used to be like down and out artists or up and coming artists or just marginalized people trying to make a living, like are all like playgrounds for rich people now,
Totally. Exactly. And I mean, I've experienced both of those New Yorks, even though I'm not a New Yorker and I didn't grow up there. I definitely, the times that I've spent significant time in New York were in the mid 70s as a child, and as an adult in the last 10 years or whatever, 15 years when I've gone and for various things. And it is and we actually, my daughter is a ballet dancer, and she spent 3 or 4 summers in New York City in the summer, and I remember being so scared, like sending her like, what? And my agent at the time was like, no, don't worry about it. Kids get on the subway here from the time they're 12 years old. You don't need to worry about it. And I was like, are you kidding? And he's like, it's like Disneyland here.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. And he's like, you don't have anything to worry about. And of course, I'm glad we did send her, because now she's very savvy when it comes to, navigating a city. But I had visions of like, seriously, like Times Square with like XXX, movies and peep shows and like drug addicts on the street and prostitutes and all these, crazy, things I had in my head that, until I went and spent time there, I was like, oh, wow, it's really like and clean and relatively and safe.
Yeah, Times Square in particular is like the biggest 180, because it used to be all like sex shops and
Right.
and brothels, and now it's like where you can see the Lion King or the Harry Potter show, like
Totally.
it's just so strange.
Yeah.
But I kind of went through the same thing, because like I was at NYU from 2001 to 2005.
Oh, cool.
And when I was moving into my dorm, my mother was like, don't go in Washington Square Park, don't go in Bryant Park. And when I finally got up to Bryant Park, I was like, this is lawyers eating lunch. Like what, like what am I supposed to be afraid of?
Totally. That's so funny. The last time I was at Bryant Park I was meeting my editor for lunch. So yeah, totally. Lots of businessy type of people, eating lovely meals.
Yeah, like overpriced salads, you know.
Right, right.
One thing that I really thought was cool too. I'm really curious about like why it's set in the Blackout Summer, because it is just like a very interesting time period for New York, but it also was like a very interesting time for the country because, you know, as I was thinking like, you know, 1976 was like this year of like amazing optimism. It's like the bicentennial year and it's like, wow, yay, way to go America. And then the next year was
Right,
just like blackouts, Summer of Sam, riots, you know, like it's just such
right, right.
a weird tumultuous time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was sort of accidental that that happened. I knew I wanted Ryan to be a certain age, and she needed to be a certain age when she was discovered. And so I kind of was like, all right, here I am in the middle of the 70s, which is also a time that's pretty vivid in my own memory. And then I was like, as I was researching, and the film Summer of Sam, so good with John Leguizamo, and I was like, oh my god, I'm in that place, like I'm here, and all these things just started falling into place, like her really genuine concerns about her mom being out and not being in touch, and a killer being on the loose targeting women who look like her mother. That was really like serendipitous in terms of the writing. And the blackout, of course, they're living in this building that, can you imagine, if the lights went out at a place like that? And so I actually asked the woman, Christina Miel, who helped me with some of my research, and she had two little boys then, and I was like, what do you remember about that night? And she said, oh, I put sleeping bags out on the balcony for the boys, and they slept out on the balcony. And I was like, oh, what a cool story. It didn't make its way into the book, but I was thinking like, this is like perfect. Sometimes there's just things that happen that are magical when you're writing, where all of a sudden the historical, reality of that time and the context all of a sudden starts feeding the story. And I was like, oh my God, the blackout happened that summer. How perfect is this? And I actually did not have a title for the photograph that's at the heart of the story for a very long time, probably until I would say almost my last draft. And then I was like, oh my God, of course it's called Blackout 1977. Like, of course it is. All this time I've been like, it's a mystery, and what am I going to call this photograph? And then there it was, and it was perfect. And things like that happen, and that's part of the joy of being a writer, is watching that sort of, like I said, serendipity, of the truth and reality of the world you're creating, all of a sudden just serving as fodder for the story.
Yeah, it's very interesting, I think, like those moments that sort of like retroactively become these kind of like, flashpoints or like interesting turning points in history. And it's interesting to have that awareness going forward too, because every once in a while I'll be doing something that I'm like, oh, this is very right now. And I always like tell my husband, I'm like, if this were like a period piece film, this would be like the detail
Right.
that they use to tell you that it's like 2022.
Right. Oh, how funny. Yeah. Yeah.
So
When you're living, I think we're acutely aware of, the fact that we're living history right now, whereas we probably didn't feel that way, in other decades, but oh man.
that has to be true. Yeah, because like I always think too about how like in the 70s, like you probably would have watched like a half hour, maybe 1 hour of news per day. And that would be like your awareness of like
Right.
global politics. And now you just know everything happening everywhere
Every
all
minute.
the time. Yeah.
Well, our joke is when the actual news, like network news, comes on at night, and you're like, and they're like, breaking news, and it's 12 hours old.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, we read about this morning as soon as it happened, and as we come on the air, and it's like, no, that's not even
So
a thing
true.
anymore.
That is so true. It's like I've already read like, 12 bad takes about this on Twitter and like
Seriously.
well, thank you so much for coming to talk about this book. I loved it so much, and I'm really excited for everybody else to get to read it too.
Oh, well, thank you. And I just want to say how much I love libraries, and I love librarians. And there's a library. I always try to plant a library in my book. And so there's the library in the village that I
Oh,
put in there.
oh my gosh, I
Ryan
totally
is the reader.
forgot. I
Yeah.
love that library. It's so
I
magical.
haven't been yet. And I need to go do a Such a Pretty Girl field trip. I have been in the courtyard of Westbeth, but I haven't been inside. And so I would love to do that. I'd love to go to the library and to the very sanitized Times Square.
Yeah. So before we go, is there anything that you're able to talk about what's next for you? Are you working on anything right now, or?
I am working on the final revisions of a book called The Still Point, and it is set in the world of pre-professional ballet, and it's about mothers. So rise, and daughters, and ambition, and art. those very similar themes that keep popping up, but a very different world from Such a Pretty Girl. It's actually my first book really set in Southern California, which is where I live during the year. So that's kind of fun. Yeah, I haven't really explored that home yet. So yeah.
Well, when that comes out, I hope that you'll consider coming back to the show and talking about that too, because this has been really great.
Thank you. Yes, this has been fun. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, listeners, you can pick up Such a Pretty Girl at your nearest independent bookstore or library as of the airing of this episode, and it is truly fantastic. This has been Jenn in conversation with Tammy Greenwood, and it is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.